Okay, so there's a lot of really important stuff going on in the AfD at the moment. A lot of really big stories that I want to cover in this video. So four stories in particular, the four biggest stories, starting off with the decision by the BFV to designate the Flugel as a right-wing extremist endeavour. I've already done a video on that, so I'm going to just skip through that pretty quickly. I think it's necessary to talk about that a little bit because it sort of really sets the stage for everything that followed. Then the decision by the AfD, the Bundesvorstand, the National Council, the National Board, the Executive Council, it's like the supreme authority of the AfD, they made a decision to ask the Flugel to dissolve itself. Then on the 1st of April, Jörg Meuthen, who is one of the co-leaders of the AfD, he gave an interview in which he suggested that the AfD should seriously consider splitting into two separate parties. So I'll talk about that. I'll explain what that was all about. And then finally, probably the most important of all of these stories, the decision by the Bundesvorstand, the Executive Council, to annul the membership of Andreas Kalbitz, who is this major figure in the east of the country. Björn Höcke and Andreas Kalbitz are the two most important members of the Flugel, which is the dominant grouping in the east of the country. The AfD, it's a grouping within the AfD, which is very strong in the east of the country. Okay, so let's start off with this press conference. The BFV, that's the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, that's Germany's domestic intelligence agency. The Flugel, that's the grouping within the AfD led by Björn Höcke and Andreas Kalbitz. It's borderline ethno-nationalist, and it's quite controversial because like some of the rhetoric that it uses is quite controversial. I'll talk more about that in a moment. So the BFV designated it as a right-wing extremist endeavour, which was going to be under permanent observation. So this means the BFV is going to be tapping phones, using informants, infiltrating the organisation with agents and so on. So it's quite a serious designation. In the video I uploaded a few weeks ago, I talked in detail about the reasons the BFV gave for this decision, but I'll summarise them briefly now. The decisions that the BFV gave fell into three broad categories. They said that when Höcke says stuff like Germany needs a 180-degree turn in how it commemorates the war, this culture of commemoration and this culture of shame and guilt. When Höcke says that, the BFV says that he's effectively trivializing the crimes of the Nazi era, and that's a problem from a constitutional point of view because the constitution of Germany is supposed to be seen as a counter proposal to the Nazi era. So anyway, that's what they said. The other issues that they brought up were that the rhetoric that the Flugel uses is sometimes racist and discriminatory, and that it infringes the human dignity of people, and this is something which is expressly forbidden in the constitution. And then the third thing they brought up was they said that the Flugel, its rhetoric suggests that it wants to overthrow the German state and that it's not committed to democracy. So those are the things that the BFV brought up. What they say is trivializing the crimes of the Nazi era. What they say is racist and discriminatory language. And then they say as well that the Flugel appears to want to overthrow the German state and to not be committed to democracy. So 8 days later, the AfD's Bundesvorstand convened and they took a decision, and they asked the Flugel to dissolve itself. So they used some quite conciliatory language, quite a soft tone. They said that they expected the Flugel to dissolve itself at its next meeting and that they had until the end of April to do this. Höcke and Kalbitz took this reasonably well. They didn't create a big fuss over this. It's important to realise as well that the AfD didn't kick out the members of the Flugel. They just asked the organisation to dissolve itself, and they were criticised about this by some people, some politicians and people in the media. They said because the problem is the ideology, not just the Flugel, and that they're not removing the people who have that ideology. So what they were doing is just window dressing really, and they're not really addressing the real problem. Why did the Bundesvorstand make this decision? Well, they're worried that this decision to place the Flügel under observation, that they're worried that the entire party could be placed under observation. And this is something which appeared in a leaked BFV report, which was leaked to the press. I'll talk about this later on, in which it said that, in fact, yes, the entire party was close to being put under observation as well. Another issue is that the Flügel isn't a formal organisation with a set membership list. So there's concern that, like, who will the BFE be able to monitor and who will they not be able to monitor if there isn't actually a set membership list. So people are worried about that, and they're worried about the optics of it as well. I mean, it's not a good look for the party having a major faction within the party being under observation and being designated as extremists. At this point, I want to talk about this Bundesvorstand, this executive committee, the supreme authority within the AfD. I want to talk about the power structures and who has power in the AfD and so on. So the two chairmen of the party are Jörg Meuthen and Tino Kruppala. So they're the chairman. That position is sometimes referred to also as the federal spokesperson. It means the same thing. They're the leaders of the party. Alexander Gauland used to hold one of those two positions, but he stood down in November because of his age and because of his health. He's been made honorary chairman, which means that he's now on the board for life. He doesn't have to seek re-election. He takes part in the meetings, but he no longer has a vote. So I've put him in this top tier, but off to the right, to show that he's not a regular chairman. The three next most important people on the board are the three vice chairpersons, and they are Alice Weidel, Stefan Brandner, and Beatrix von Storch. Weidel and Gauland are the leaders of the parliamentary faction in the Bundestag. Now, that's not as important a position as the position that Meuthen and Kruppala hold. The really important decisions regarding the AfD and its ideology and its direction are taken by this Bundesvorstand. Next, we have Carsten Hutter and Joachim Kuhs. They are the treasurer and the secretary, respectively, of the party. And then we have just 6 regular members of the board, the most significant of whom is Andreas Kalbitz. So 2 significant absentees from the board, 2 people who are not on the board, Björn Hucke and probably Gottfried Curio is probably the most high profile person not on the board. He stood against Kruppala back in November for one of those 2 co-chair positions, and he was defeated by Kruppala in that vote. So let's go through some of these people, just give an idea of where they stand. So Jörg Meuthen, he's from the west of Germany. He's emerging as the leader of the anti-Flügel faction within the party, the faction that really doesn't like the Flügel and maybe would prefer the Flügel to become a separate party. Kruppala, he's from the east. He's not a member of the Flügel, but he would be a lot more positively disposed towards the Flügel, a lot more friendly towards it. Gauland is also from the east. He's also friendly towards the Flügel, but not part of it. Gauland has said some controversial stuff himself in the past, some pretty spicy stuff. Weidel, she's from the west. Now, she's interesting because she was originally an opponent of Hucke, but in the last couple of years, she's moved much closer to Hucke, and her relationship with Hucke and Guts Kubitschek, who is a friend of Hucke and who is ideologically quite close to Hucke. Kubitschek isn't part of a member of the AfD, but he's a significant figure within the German right. He's an significant ideological figure, an important figure, and Weidel has spoken at one of Kubitschek's events, which shows that she's moved a lot closer to Hucke. Stefan Brandner, he's a member of the Flügel, so he's the first member of the Flügel we've come across, and von Storch, she would be seen as an opponent of the Flügel. She's criticised them in the past. This vote to ask the Flügel to dissolve itself, the result was 11-1-1, so 11 in favour, 1 abstention and 1 against. The abstention was Brandner and the vote against, unsurprisingly, was Kalbitz. Although German media reports that Gauland was opposed to this as well, so if he had a vote, he probably would have voted against this as well. Okay, so let's move on to the next story then. On the 1st of April, Jörg Meuthen gave an interview with Tichy's Einblick, which is a conservative website, and he said that the AfD should consider splitting in 2. So let's talk now in detail about what this division in the AfD is. So you have the AfD in the West and the AfD in the East, and they're two largely different parties. And the AfD in the East is basically the Flügel. So the AfD in the East and the Flügel, these two terms are largely used interchangeably to represent these two ideologies. So you've sort of this more moderate faction, or the AfD in the West, and then you have this Flügel faction, which is sometimes referred to as the AfD in the East. So those terms are largely used interchangeably. I mean, there are more moderate members in the East and there are Flügel supporters in the West, but it's largely a West-East division. So the AfD in the West is essentially a normal centre-right party. Most of the people from West Germany in the AfD would happily be members of the CDU, which is Merkel's party, or the FDP, which is the right of centre liberal party. They would happily be members of those parties if those parties would just take a stronger position on migrants and a more sceptical position on the EU, especially the euro. They're the two issues that keep the AfD members in the West out of those two parties, because they would agree with most of the other stuff that those parties stand for. They're a little bit more nationalist as well, the AfD in the West, than those two parties, a little bit more socially conservative, but most of those people would happily be members of the CDU and the FDP if they just took a harder line on migrants and the euro. Now, the AfD in the East is very different. The AfD in the East is not a centre-right party. The AfD in the East really belongs to what's known as the New Right. So that the New Right exists on the political spectrum between the centre-right and the far right. So I would define the far right as being white nationalists, literal neo-Nazis, whether openly or behind closed doors. So the New Right is between those. It's between the centre-right and the far right. The New Right, very preoccupied with issues of identity, immigration, demographics, that type of thing. Not as interested in economic issues, but when they do talk about the economy, they're more willing to embrace left-wing solutions to economic problems, generous welfare, for example, and they're very critical of globalization, also critical of capitalism sometimes. The AfD in the East, the Flügel, I would say the party that it's most similar to would probably be Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National in France. You have this New Right in France as well, the Nouvelle Droite. In Germany, it's the Neue Rechte. They're quite similar, and the New Right in France, the Rassemblement National, is very much a product of the New Right in France. So that's the difference between the two wings in the party. The AfD in the East being more extreme when it comes to its rhetoric about nationalism, etc., and also being, so it's further, the AfD in the East is further to the right in terms of nationalism, but it's further to the left in terms of economic issues compared to the AfD in the West. So the idea of splitting the party in two is that without the Flügel, without this rhetoric from people like Hücke and Kalbitz, like there's a sense that that type of rhetoric scares away moderate voters in West Germany. And without the Flügel, the AfD in the West would be able to adopt a more moderate tone, and it would also be able to adopt more conventional centre-right, liberal conservative economic policies, and that they would, as a result, attract a lot more voters away from the CDU and the FDP. And this is what Meuthen says in this interview. He doesn't talk so much about the rhetoric. He talks, he tries to shy away from being too controversial, but he talks more about the economic side of things as well. He says that the AfD in the East, the Flügel, would then be able to, if it existed on its own, it would be able to adopt more left-wing policies, and it in turn would attract more voters away from Die Linke. So Meuthen sees the AfD in the West attracting voters away from the CDU and the FDP, and the AfD in the East attracting voters away from Die Linke. Meuthen says this isn't a West-East thing, but I mean it is really. It's mostly an East-West thing, despite what he says. Now this interview by Moiten, this idea that he floated, it didn't gain a lot of traction, not a lot of support. Alexander Gowland said that he was opposed to it. He said it's normal for a party to have different factions within it, especially a young party like the AfD. Even Beatrix von Storck, who's not known as a supporter of the Flügel, she said that the AfD should be a party that can represent everyone on the right. Now we move on to the fourth and probably the most important of all these stories. So on the 15th of May, the Bundesvorstand, the executive committee, took a decision to annul the membership of Andreas Kalbitz. And they said they did this because Kalbitz had concealed his membership of the Heimattreue Deutsche Jugend. So the Heimattreue Deutsche Jugend, that means the loyal or faithful to the homeland German youth. This is an organization which ran summer camps for people between the ages of 7 and 29. It's routinely referred to as neo-Nazi by the press, by the government and the security agencies. Now, it wasn't neo-Nazi in the sense that literally they were waving swastikas and playing videos of speeches by Hitler, but there seems to be a certainty that the people who are running this really were literally neo-Nazis. I know the term Nazi and neo-Nazi is bandied around a lot, but in this case, I think the people, when it's used, they mean it literally. The German Interior Ministry, which banned the HDJ in 2009, it said that its purpose was to train a, quote, neo-Nazi elite under the guise of an ostensibly apolitical recreational summer camp. So this is a controversial organization to have been involved in. This story's been going on in the German press for years. What is the nature of Kalbitz's involvement in this organization? Was he a member or not? There's been various photos of him, even one video of him at some of these events. Kalbitz admits that he attended 2 HDJ events, but he has always denied that he was a member. And that's important because the AfD has a ban. If you were a member of an extremist organization, you're not allowed to join the AfD. So that's what the issue is here. If Kalbitz was a member of this in the past and he didn't disclose that, then that would mean that he wouldn't have been eligible for membership. And that was the basis on which they annulled his membership. So as I said, Kalbitz has always denied that he was a member of the HDJ, but in March of this year, the BFV or somebody in the BFV leaked an internal report to Der Spiegel magazine, and this report contained what it says is, what the BFV says is a membership list of the Heimattreue Deutsche Jugend, and listed under number 01330 is the quote, Andreas Kalbitz family. Now Kalbitz still denies that he was a member. He says he doesn't know anything about this. He says that it's possible or probable even that his name appears on a contact list or a list of people who expressed interest in joining, but he still maintains that he was never a member. So let's go back to the Bundesvorstand and its members. Now, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is a major newspaper in Germany, has listed who voted how in this vote. So the result was 7-1-5, 7 in favour, 1 abstention, 5 against. So you can see it was a very close vote, and it seems that Gowland was opposed to it, so he probably would have voted. It probably would have been 7-1-6 if he had been allowed to vote. So Moiten, it was his idea. He was pushing this. He voted in favour, according to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Von Storck voted in favour, Joachim Kuhs, and then 4 of the regular members as well. So you can see most of the support for this came from the lower orders of the Bundesvorstand. Tino Kruppala and Alice Weidel voted against. What they wanted was for an independent legal team to come in and examine this and to provide a summary or an opinion. Alice Weidel has said that this decision is legally challengeable. Alexander Gowland has said that the decision was wrong and very dangerous for the party. Like this is a really messy issue. There's a lot of problems here, starting with the actual membership application form from Calbut's dating back in 2013 when he joined. That membership form is now missing, but there are 2 witnesses who claim they can remember what was written on it. There's then also a question of whether the Bundesvorstand actually has the authority to annul his membership or not. Okay, so let's talk now about some more reactions. Calbut's, he's said that he's going to take all legal action to defend this, against this decision. Calbut's state chapter in Brandenburg, the Brandenburg AfD, have stood by Calbut's, as has Björn Höcke. So this is developing into a real problem. Calbut's has said that the BFV is acting to defend the government and not the constitution. The BFV actually means literally the Federal Agency for the Protection of the Constitution. And Calbut's is saying the BFV is not defending the constitution, it's actually defending the government. And this is something the AfD has been saying for years. And he's also saying that the people in the AfD who have voted for this, they're effectively doing the work of the BFV and of the party's opponents for them. And Höcke himself, what has he said? Well, he said some quite similar things to Calbut's. He's largely bitten his tongue up to this point after the designation of the Flügel as extremist, and then after when the Bundesvorstand asked it to dissolve itself, and then after Meuten's interview, Höcke didn't really say much. But after this decision to effectively expel Calbut's, I mean, Höcke is no longer holding back, and he's not happy about this at all. He's saying this isn't a clear case, which is shown by the close result. And he's saying that Meuthen is trying to save his own skin, that this is being done for political reasons because he has low approval ratings. He also says that Meuthen and von Storch, he clearly sees those two as the ringleaders of this whole thing. He said there's a real push in the party at the moment to divide it into East and West and to create a different type of AfD. He said that Meuthen's vision of the party is as a party that could sort of go into be a junior coalition partner for the CDU. And he said that's not right because that's not what the AfD is. The AfD is supposed to be an alternative. He says Meuthen is no longer willing or no longer able to represent the entire party. So he's saying some quite strong stuff here. Also in a video, he used the phrase Verrat begehen, which means to commit treason. So he's saying the people who voted for this are committing treason, and that they're doing, like what Calbut says, that they're doing the work of the party's opponents for them, and that they're allowing the state to decide the AfD's internal personnel policy. The graphic on the right, it says Volkspartei bleiben, so remain a Volkspartei, a people's party. A Volkspartei, the idea of that is that it's a broad party which can represent lots of different people, everyone really, within reason, but it's not a party with a narrow ideological focus. So he's saying there should be room for the Flügel and the more moderate Western wing, the liberal conservative wing, as Meuthen refers to it. And he says here Wahlkampf instead of Machtkampf. So Wahlkampf is the AfD should be fighting to win votes rather than fighting for power within the party. He's referring to Meuthen, what Meuthen's doing here. And then at the bottom he says for a wide spectrum of opinion in the AfD and against splitting and exclusion. Now, this post by Höcke was on May the 21st. At that time, there was a lot of talk about holding a special party convention to resolve this whole issue. Resolve the future direction of the party, Calbut's, what to do about him, and Meuthen's leadership. Now, that's since that talk has sort of been died down a lot. Afterwards, there seems to be a consensus now that they should let the legal action that Calbut's is taking, they should let that take its course before then moving on to a special party convention. Okay, so that's a lot of information, a lot of stuff to digest. I think I'll leave it at that. If anything isn't clear, please post in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. Meanwhile, thanks for watching and until next time.